good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming here in Geneva, and thank you for those of you online. We will use these microphones so that the people online can hear, and try and remember that. We will not show your faces online at any time, as long as you don't turn around and look at the camera, so that your privacy is respected. If you'd like to ask a question, we will take questions from the room later, but also you can use the hashtag, which is extremely easy to remember, and, oh, that one, yeah. With the @ sign, really? Okay. If that hashtag, so feel free to throw something on Twitter if you want to join the conversation, and you don't particularly feel like putting your hand up. I've been have the honor and the somewhat scary privilege of moderating this conversation. Scary because it's a specialized area in which I don't have very much knowledge, so I'm here to learn. I'm also here to hopefully prevent people from being too long-winded and keep them on their toes. My experience is as a sort of gamekeeper turned poacher. I worked for the UN for many years and for some NGOs and donors. My last UN job was in Mogadishu, where I have to say we had a fascinating zoo of military and security contractors, special forces, and trainers, and so on and so forth. So I'm very familiar with the environment. I'm familiar somewhat with the characters and the kind of types that show up at these situations. I'm less familiar with the systems that have evolved to try and maintain quality, human rights, respect for the local community, and so on. So I'm really genuinely pleased to be here because I hope to learn a lot. I'm not going to give you their CVs. They can introduce themselves and what they do and how they ended up in this field. So first of all, we're going to start with Jamie, whose job it is to work on this. He will explain what and how he does that. And then he will set the scene, and then we're going to talk to the other panelists, all of whom have slightly different expertise and specialist knowledge. So Jamie, you can kick us off, please. Thank you.
And how much time do I have?
You have, up to 10 minutes.
Up to 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I'm not too good with microphones single-handed, so I might move around. My name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct Association. I've been the Executive Director for about 2 years or thereabouts. As the Chair asked us to speak a little bit about ourselves, I was previously with the International Committee of the Red Cross about 10 years, and then before then with the United Nations in Rwanda, Tanzania, Sierra Leone, and former Yugoslavia. So fairly new to the International Code of Conduct Association, but I think fairly old to the world of humanitarian activities, and to, I think, sort of the rise of different types of actors that we see in a sort of conflict zone, in hostile environments. I won't take too much time. Just a quick show of hands. How many of you here know anything about the International Code of Conduct Association, if I may? About 3, 4, okay, about 3% of the room or thereabouts. So I'll give you a quick sort of elevator pitch about the International Code of Conduct Association. How many of you in the room know about Erik Prince and Blackwater? Okay, that's a good starting point. So take Erik Prince and Blackwater as a starting point to this discussion. And the reaction of the international community, in particular led by the Swiss government and the ICRC, to effectively remind states of their so-called pre-existing international legal obligations under IHL and human rights treaties. And the idea through that particular initiative was to put in place a soft law document which will effectively tell states and remind states that they had obligations with regard to private military and security contractors, in particular in conflict zones. And so we saw the development in 2008 or thereabouts of the Montreux document. And for those of you who have time on your planes and trains, read it. But it's simply a soft law instrument, which is a reminder to governments of their pre-existing responsibilities. Post-2008, 2009, when that document was signed by about 17 or so governments, it's now about 55 or so governments that have signed up to it. The Swiss in particular, the UK and the US, then determined that actually it's good to have the treaty reminder, but it also would be very, very useful to have a specific code of conduct for the actors themselves, for the private security contractors specifically, rather than the military companies or contractors. We can talk about the differences in a bit. So in 2010, an international code of conduct was developed for private security companies, in particular those operating in so-called complex environments. The signing ceremony took place in 2010, and about 700 or thereabouts companies signed up to the International Code of Conduct. The International Code of Conduct covers a whole range of provisions linked to human rights obligations, some humanitarian law obligations, everything from use of force, detention, apprehension, sort of human trafficking, etc. The next step then, again led by the Swiss government and a few others, was to say, well, we have a code of conduct, but now we need an oversight governance mechanism to ensure that the code of conduct is effectively implemented in country by the security companies. And hence the creation of the International Code of Conduct Association in 2013. I'll finish the elevator pitch in a second before getting to the issues. It's a multi-stakeholder organization, which means it brings governments, security companies, and civil society organizations to the table. We have 7 governments members, 91 security companies at present. I think 5 or 6 more coming to the table as well. So 95, 96 security companies operating in 35 different countries, and approximately 35 civil society organizations, plus a range of observers, everything from think tanks to universities, certification bodies, and the likes. And the whole idea of the association is to work with companies to ensure that they implement the code through a range of activities, everything from monitoring, evaluation, in-country remote, a whole certification process, exchange of best practices, capacity building, etc. And that's effectively where I'll stop the elevator pitch on the association, and then go to some of the issues that we're looking at. A few months ago, the association adopted a strategic plan, a 5-year strategic plan to reflect a little bit about how the landscape had evolved over the past few years, noting a little bit the evolution of the private security landscape, and trying to be a bit more detailed and I think a bit more nuanced in the issues that we're tackling. So I think 4 or 5 key points I'll make before handing over in these small 10 minutes. The first is certainly a definitional issue, a definition. Everyone speaks about PMSCs. We hear military contractors, security companies, and mercenaries being used in the same sentence, and quite often in a confusing manner. What the ICOCA has been trying to do over the past few years is actually try to take out the security company component. Our focus is on security contractors, and our focus is on the fact that you have security companies operating in complex environments, post-conflict, fragile environments, including conflict environments. And we could talk about the landscape later on as well. We're not speaking about military contractors. We have a particular set of activities and a particular, I think, role, usually alongside military and armed forces. And we're not talking about mercenaries either. You know, people refer to, for instance, the Wagner Group at times, or to Bob Donard, who went down to the Comore Islands, or to executive outcomes, etc. That's not what we're considering. We're very much looking at security companies, like G4S, for instance, operating in those conflict environments. The second point of 5, I would say, is a question of acceptance. 10 or so years ago, we would not have this kind of discussion because many individuals and many organizations refused to accept that private security companies had a role to play, be it positive or negative, in complex environments. There's an inability on the part of many to even recognize that those companies existed, despite the fact that we saw them on the streets, despite the fact that they carried out major contracts. And that's, I think, been a major evolution on this dialogue, that we're now speaking about the fact that they are security companies and they have a role to play in these complex environments. There's an impact issue as well. You know, what is the impact of these security companies in these environments? The debate is also a bit more nuanced. 10 or so years ago, the discussion was simply about, you know, human rights consequences of actions on the part of these security companies. Excessive use of force, detaining individuals, shooting at civilians in the streets, and the likes. And it was all a negative discussion. But we also have to look at the issues and the impacts with regard to private security contractors in the sense of how are the security companies treating their own personnel. It verges on labor employment issues as well. How do they interact with local communities? What role do they have to play, positive or negative, with local communities as major employers? The issues also need to be considered. Very few people out there actually understand what is a true sort of, I think, impact and consequences of actions of security companies in different parts of the world. I was in Juba last week. I was in northern Kenya at the weekend. I'm off to China tomorrow. Every environment offers a different sets of issues, but very few people actually understand what those issues actually are. If I'd ask any number of you if you know how security companies operate and what kind of human rights concerns they are, very few will be able to give the information. And so how we actually unravel that and unpack that particular point would be particularly important. And there's a question of responsibility. And I'll finish here, Chair, on the question of responsibility. Where does the responsibility lie? It's always the simplest way to look at it is to identify the security companies as the causes of anything negative. Point the finger at the security providers. But security providers are commercial entities. They provide services that people use, that people contract, that entities, NGOs, humanitarian actors, commercial, look at Sean, oil companies, etc. There's a demand for security providers. And so responsibility lies not only at the bottom of the supply chain with the security providers themselves, but it has to make its way all the way up the supply chain. That any entity, however small or big, that uses a security company itself has responsibilities from a risk management, due diligence, and potential accountability with regard to the actions of the security companies. And maybe we can develop that at a later stage. I'll stop here within the 10 minutes, I hope, Chair.
Oh, you're very good. Yeah. I gave them all a talk before. They've been whipped into line nicely. I'm going to give you one more minute to say, is it working?
2 minutes? Yeah, okay. Yes, I would say. But we're very much at the beginning of the process. And by is it working, I presume you're asking as to whether or not the kind of oversight and sort of the identifying the issues and making individuals more accountable and responsible, if that's where your question is about, yes, certainly. The debate we're having now, the issues we're looking at 5 years ago, there was very little understanding or awareness of the fact that this was an issue. There was very little understanding in terms of the numbers of security companies operating in different contexts. And there was very little dialogue as well. And to give an example of a dialogue, we were in Erbil in Iraq a few weeks ago. We organized a workshop with about 16 or 17 local NGOs from different provinces, and we brought the security companies to the room as well. So we had 3 member companies sitting with the NGOs. And it was the first time that any one of them had interacted with one another. For the security companies to be in front of local NGOs and for NGOs to be looking at these international security companies, the first 10 minutes was a disaster. No one spoke. But then they suddenly realized they had common issues at stake. That's how it's working, that you're creating that dialogue as well in theatre.
Thank you very much. So, to follow my own rules, can you keep that on, it's fine, because next up we have Beatrice, whose organization Civic works on these issues, and she will explain more of the risks and the challenges.
Sure, you already started the conversation with your question on is it working or not, actually. So my name is Beatrice Godefroy, I'm the Europe Director for Civic, and for those who don't know Civic, we are an organization that does research and advocacy on patterns on civilian harm in conflicts. And we also go one step further than other NGOs in so that we deliver training and expertise and support policy guidance on questions related to the protection of civilian and civilian harm mitigations. How do you operationalize, basically, when you're a government and an armed force, civilian protection? And so we're also, as Civic, fairly new in this conversation. We became a member of the ICOCA a year ago, approximately, and I'm sitting in the board of ICOCA since a year. Since, as Jamie mentioned, this is a multi-stakeholder initiative, so we have a CSO pillar and a few CSO representatives in the board. And so going a little bit, building up on the challenges that you mentioned, let's say first, the reason why it's interesting for an organization like Civic, who is working in conflict with governments and armed forces, to get involved in this question is that the overall, let's say, issue of PMSCs, and I'm going to expand it a little bit more, is indeed a trend of exponential growth of outsourcing and externalization of private, of security and defense activities. And this corresponds actually to an evolution of the, let's say, the modalities of warfare and the way war is being waged today. you have obviously a number of governments that conduct hostilities and are present directly on the ground, but you also have a variety of functions which are today being externalized. And so I think this is important to signal this trend. Also, a number of Western governments and other governments will work through security force assistance, meaning supporting logistics, intelligence, securing sites or infrastructure. And in that sense, security force assistance opens also the door to a bigger need for private security or private security and military support to national governments and local partners. So I think it's a trend that's here, that's growing, and that's why it's so important to have such initiative as the ICOCA, or let's say the general framework of the Montreux Document Forum. Building on the challenges, I would say, and I think it's really interesting, Jamie, that you mentioned indeed that the ICOCA is specifically focused on private security and not private military and security companies. That's actually one of the challenges that we face. What is the border between private military and private security? When you see sometimes the level of equipment, when you see the type of activities that private security can be engaged into, you have a question mark. When you see also indeed that some of the private security, let's say, companies would be themselves related or connected to bigger groups, we do also private military activities, the question mark is also all the more relevant. So I just would like to put that on the table as well. Another area of challenge is actually the challenges that we are facing as civil society. The reason why also there is not enough awareness or maybe a visibility on this topic is that because there is no data. It's a sector that, not strictly speaking private security indeed, but let's say private security and military activities, which are highly opaque. Let's face it. There is very little case studies, very little consolidated data, very little monitoring happening, and there are great initiatives actually that have been started to actually increase the awareness and the information. But when it comes to having a sense of where we are in terms of civilian harm caused by the activities of private security companies, for instance, or private military companies, it's something that is actually missing. And this challenge actually links me to another one, which is also typically in the ICOCA. So it's great to see that the certification and monitoring function are indeed, that the certification, function are moving forward, but the monitoring role is actually still lagging behind, and that's a topic that we discussed very much in our conversation on the strategic plan. Of course, you have divergent interest within the multi-stakeholder initiative, which I believe is just something we should take stock of. You obviously will have private companies who have an objective that is a business objective, and you will have civil society who will look at population, human rights, implementation of international humanitarian law, and obviously sometimes these two interests can converge, but sometimes they can diverge as well. So I think it's also an interesting topic for discussion to see how to move this topic forward and to make progress on having this framework and more compliance from private security companies. We have to deal with those divergent interests and how to create this dialogue and this conversation at the local level and at the global level within ICOCA. And maybe the last challenge I would like to mention is also with regards to civil society as clients. I'm sure others, and I will leave to Sean the space to speak of the perspective of other clients, but civil societies are not only there to monitor and to kind of put pressure or create a healthy tension, so to say, on this question. They are also very much a client of private security companies. And those of us in the room who have been deployed in the field have witnessed that, be it with the UN or with big organizations. As you said, in Somalia, you were speaking of a zoo. There was a very interesting report, actually, from the Global Policy Forum in 2014, looking at these challenges that it created for the UN. UN are more and more exposed to security risks, especially in environments where counterterrorism operations are going on. They're a target. as others, and as being a target that needs more security, especially also to secure the civilian components of the mission, which means having recourse to private security heavily. And they noticed during this report in 2014 that they had the risk of entering into dangerous partnerships. That's the terminology that they used, and therefore they started, of course, this internal reflection on reinforcing their compliance frameworks, let's say, or expectations, their internal frameworks and regulations. But I think this, the report is 5 years old, but I think it's very much valid for the whole, humanitarian and NGO sector in terms of the type of vigilance that is being needed and frameworks that we all need to implement when it comes to contracting private security. So again, I very much salute and welcome the initiative of the ICOCA. I'm really glad to be, part of this conversation, including with the colleagues of DCAP and with our members. But I think it's moving forward. A number of challenges still need to be addressed, and for civil society, it's it's always a dilemma. Actually, would you better get involved to the risk of maybe seeing your image of a participation being co-opted, or do you prefer to be hands-on and actually contribute to make propositions and recommendations to move forward to have the internal safeguards put in place?
Thank you very much. I think we'll return to some of those questions that you've raised. Interesting problems. Now, Marlène, you work in a particular section of this niche, so please tell us about that.
Thanks a lot. So I work for DCAF. DCAF is the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance. We're based in Geneva, and it's security sector governance and security sector reform organization. So we support states and international partners supporting states in improving the governance of the security sector, so that the security sector is more effective, but also more accountable. So you'd say, why do we work in this sector? It's also very much, according to what Jamie said, a recognition that private security in some states, actually, the number of private security individuals or companies actually outweigh the public security sphere. So they are much like they're an actor that needs to be engaged in order to address the governance of the security sector in a more holistic way. We also, and the area where I work in is looking at how the extractive sector as a client of private security providers can also have a leverage into improving the practice of private security companies. As we know, the extractive sector and most of the extractive companies operate in a very challenging environment and complex environment, where, I mean, that can be an environment of like active armed conflict ongoing, like in Central African Republic, post-conflict settings with weak governance structures. Like I just came back from the DRC last week, so the Copper Belt, for instance, would be one of those. Or in places where there is an accrued poverty, violence within different communities, and I think that it really rings the bell maybe for Sean in the operation of Tulo in Kenya. So of course, when extractive companies start operations in this context, they need security. They need security for the investment, they need security for their operations, they need security for the staff. And so the question is, how do they deal with this security without violating the rights of the communities that are situated next to them? That's really how the whole initiative in which DCAF is an observer and is supporting started. And I'm talking about the Voluntary Principles Initiative on Security and Human Rights. And so the VPs, as we call it, is a set of principles that companies should follow in order to ensure their security while not violating the rights of communities next to them. And so I'm not going to go too much into details, but they need to conduct a risk assessment before, during their operation as well. And this risk assessment needs to really lead them to decide on how they will how much security they will have around their site, who they will be working with, both public security or private security, and what are the good principles that they should be implementing in order for them to have responsible practices on the ground. What are the challenges? It's something that Jamie touched upon a little bit at the beginning. Of course, we have different set of challenges, and one is more on the practices of private security companies that can lead to human rights violation. I was again taking into example the DRC where I was last week. You have private security providers that are contracted by extractive companies around them, and there is a high level of conflict between large-scale mining and small-scale mining, and artisanal and small-scale miners. And one way they're dealing with it, for instance, is to have dogs that would prevent artisanal and small-scale miners coming. And there are huge incidents with like dogs coming and biting artisanal small-scale miners, and this is very much a problem for the trust with the local communities, etc., etc. So there are these issues of human rights challenges. There are also these issues of, as Jamie mentioned, what are the practices within these private security companies in terms of training, in terms of vetting, in terms of oversight that is provided. And this is also something that needs to be worked on. And I think that Jamie put them like in two different boxes, but I think that the more there is a right for the employees, the more there are good practices within the organization, and the less there will be violations of human rights towards those communities. So yeah, I think I'll stop here and then I'll come back a bit later.
Okay. Yeah, I have questions, but we'll hear from Sean before I spoil the whole schedule that they've given me to follow. Sean, you will be able to speak to us from a very specific perspective with your own work. I won't say more than that. Please introduce yourself.
I will. I'm Sean McMurtry. I work for a company called Tullow Oil. I work on our Kenya project. I've been there for the last 7 years. It's in an area in northwest Kenya called Turkana. I have been in the private security industry, involved in the private security industry for the last 20 years across the Middle East and Africa. Prior to that, I was a military policeman with the British Army. Again, during the time when it was relatively moral to be a soldier, when we were involved in sort of robust humanitarian interventions, peacekeeping operations, things like that. So I've been around conflict for quite a bit. I come from Belfast, so it's sort of almost in my blood. So that's who I am. I think everybody, it's always the worst being the sort of last guy because everybody said so much. I think what I'll try and do is bring it down to the grassroots level, bring it down to that sort of practical level. Everybody talked about complexity. Everybody talked about sort of complex environments, working in complex environments. Northwest Kenya is one of those environments. You think of Kenya as safari, as sort of the Lion King, this sort of thing, but there are areas of Kenya with terribly low development indices, very, very sort of weak levels of governance, porous borders, proliferation of firearms, areas which have been affected by climate change and therefore the core livelihoods of pastoralism and agriculture are equally affected, and you have long-standing interethnic rivalries which are exacerbated by the lack of resources or conflict over those resources, and again exacerbated by weapons and governance. So it is quite a complex conflict system, pre-existing conflict system. So very, very low levels of development, industrialization, modernization, opportunity, youth. And then you bring a large-scale private sector development project into that, and it interacts, it changes that system. There's, development equals change, change equals conflict. It's, I'm moving house at the minute, and there's conflict in our house because we're moving house because of the change. So, it's obviously on a much smaller scale, but
you're not actually
equally as
moving house,
impactful.
you're in a conference.
Well, okay, not at the
Maybe
minute, but at the minute, I definitely feel like I'm moving house. So this is what happens, and how that sort of manifests itself. I try to explain it in a series of circles. A series of concentric circles. The inner circle, and this sort of series of circles also represents, I think, to a degree, that sort of responsibility, the sphere of responsibility that the private sector actor has, or the industry has, or the markets have in managing peace, in managing conflict, in managing this sort of complexity. So that inner circle is what I would refer to as the community company conflict. Now that's direct that's direct conflict between the community around us, our key stakeholders and ourselves, generally brought around just by our presence, by how we do business. People talk about conflict-sensitive business practices. People talk about sort of security and human rights. These are all the things that we need to do well to try and integrate with the people around us and to bring those in and build a better relationship. But it's not always easy. We come from the oil and gas industry. We come up with high levels of health and safety and all of these rules and regulations which are just not understood locally at all. There's things around sort of contractual agreements and legislation around, again, employment law and things like that, which just been so alien to people there. But we must follow it. But it's not how things have been done. So there's that whole sort of change and sort of difference of opinion, which is problematic, and these issues manifest as, sort of anything from small scale, what we call community work interruptions, is where small groups or families will pull brush across the road and stop a vehicle and ask a question about a certain thing, or it will escalate into, sort of strikes and protests and demonstrations, of which we've actually had relatively few, but, there have been a couple, and that's where, the sort of public security and the private security must intervene to ensure the rule of law, to protect people and assets, etc. So that sort of central areas, that's what keeps me up at night. That's my biggest concern. And that's where things like ICOCA, the VPSHR, these things are there to try and help us, to give us handrails and guidelines to how we should behave and how our providers should behave to ensure that we manage that sensitively. Then you come out, the next circle, and this was something I didn't really recognize until we got there, was intra-community tension. This is where you have small groups, families, clans. It doesn't really sort of go beyond clan level. This is where you have, for instance, a village, and you want to put a well pad next to that particular village. And the way you...
well pad?
Where you put a big hole in the ground and suck oil out. So you put a drilling rig next to the village. That particular village then wants the opportunities and benefits, or wants a lion's share of the opportunities and benefits. But then another village is relatively close, and they claim that land. And then you have those people that have been living together quite happily for a long time, or relatively happily for a long time. They then come into conflict over that particular resource and the benefits therein. So it's almost, you're injecting a new livelihood or a new opportunity for livelihood into something that has been sort of quite traditional previously. So that's an area, and again, that's this area, and the next one I'm going to talk about is an area where private sector struggle because it's not our responsibility. We're part of the problem, and we need to be part of the solution. But ultimately, it's down to the state. This is about governance more than it is about sort of private security managing their impacts. So we need to try and encourage the government to do more around these sort of spaces. And this comes back to the idea of private military companies, etc. We talk about sort of responsibility. And personally, I think it sits with government, but it's another conversation. So the final circle then is inter-community or cross-border conflict. And that is where you see land becoming more strategically, more economically, and politically important because of the resource therein. And I think I need to be very clear here as well. I'm talking from the extractive's perspective. And of course, we have a reputation around this sort of thing. But this is development. This is agribusiness. This is geothermal. This is solar. Anything, any sort of development activity, anything that brings modernization, anything that brings developmental change, will react in this way in these conflict systems. And I think, to be honest, having been involved in this for the last 20 years, I think the extractives are probably a lot more mature in understanding how to manage this than a lot of other industry actors, because of the focus that we've had, because of the experiences that we've had, and because of things like the voluntary principles that have sort of brought us through. So that's a sort of snapshot of the sort of the three my magical three circles. Just to finish off, one of the things we talked about there about the role of private security. You need again that inner circle, the one that keeps me up at night. That's where we see our private security contractors really helping us, trying to navigate this space. And again, it comes back to the idea that there are some good ones and there are some not so good ones. And the trick is to find the good ones early and stick with them. And I think when it comes back to responsibility, is that, as a client, it is our responsibility as a client, it's our responsibility to find the good ones, stick with the good ones, and assure their practices. And that's where, through our standards, we can talk a little bit about standards later on. Or if there's no good ones there, it's to build the capacity of the good ones to be good ones, and that's something we can talk about a bit later as well. Did I hit 10, or was I short?
I never gave you 10.
Oh, should have asked.
Okay, so that first part was we were inviting the panel to talk about the challenges and the risks and the problems that might arise. They'd started to talk a bit about solutions or mitigation, but we're going to come to that. But let me just ask a few questions of you before we move to all these different initiatives. Sean, how many security people do you employ?
Oh God. Right. At one stage we had.
Take that mic, would you mind? Sorry. Just to give us an
very good
example
with
of.
Okay, at one stage we had, the scale of our operation was from the northern border area with Ethiopia, right the way down to the middle of Lake Victoria, which is basically half of the Rift Valley. We had 3,500 people working for us at any one stage, and 5 or 6 different sort of operational footprints in that enormous space. To secure that, we had over 350 security officers and close to 300 public security police officers, which was, in my mind, excessive. We can talk about that later. But that's, you're talking 600-700 people involved in that project from a security perspective. It was pretty significant.
Thank you. So one of the questions I have is these initiatives, they've come up because of internationalization. I mean, surely there was always security firms, there was always security needs, there was always contractors involved in keeping different parts of public life safe. It's not clear to me where, for example, your project, it must be funded by a donor, it must have limits. Are you doing what if it's a domestic security firm working for a domestic company? Is that part of this world of initiatives and voluntary principles? Where do you draw the line? It seems like a very big problem to attack all at once.
Well, I think to be clear, we don't work with private security companies directly. We work in a very multi-stakeholder approach. So our aim is really to bring people together in order to identify the challenges and respond to it. So we don't have a specific work with private security providers. For us, in terms of, like, for instance, we are facilitating working groups at the national and regional level on how to implement the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And in those working groups, there are members of the government, mining industry, for instance, or mining ministry. There are members of public security forces, the police, the army, intelligence sometimes. There are private security providers, companies, and those can be international ones or they can be local ones. They don't need to be affiliated to anything. They just need to share their concerns, and they usually come because they have, they want to learn about good practices and implement them on the ground. So it doesn't really matter if it's like the size of those, don't really matter. Recently, for instance, and again, because I've been living there for a long time, so I have always this example, but we're working with artisan small-scale mining communities in the DRC, in the South Kivu province. And there, the private security arrangement can be very artisanal as well. So you have mining cooperatives that have a couple of guys that are assuring the security. And those guys can sometimes, like, we had, for instance, an incident where because of problems between two mining cooperatives over land and access to certain resources, they were using weapons, and there were some people that were injured. There were other people that were put into like prisons for some time, and this is something of concern. And to tackle this particular challenge, you need to talk to mining cooperative and not specifically private security companies, you know. And you need to reinforce their capacity. You need to train them, and you need to keep on spreading the message somehow.
Okay, thank you. One for you, I think, really, Baptiste, is when you join, you're now on the board of this thing. Are there other initiatives that you have to coordinate with, other business and human rights initiatives and protection of civilian initiatives? Where does this fit in the bigger puzzle of protection of civilians?
It's a good question. It doesn't really fit for now because you have several. Basically, you have the community working on around the Business and Human Rights Forum, the voluntary principle, which is indeed, as Marlon was mentioning, which has started to do some multi-stakeholders type of work since several years. And the whole world of the protection of civilians and international humanitarian law implementation is another sector. It's more connected to the humanitarians, and I think that's not that I want to add more confusion to the conversation, but I think we're right in the middle of this confusion between where to draw the line between security and military services, especially when you are in complex and unstable environments that Sean was describing very well before. So typically Civic is involved in environments of conflicts. In this situation, even if you're delivering private security, you can be in a position to, even in a reactive manner, resort to the use of force and be basically drawn to the battlefield. And that's the reason why this conversation is interesting for organizations like Civic and for kind of the broader, humanitarian and protection world. It's how this organization, while being put in this position to use force, will have the right way to react and to deal with it. And there it's very interesting because if you look concretely, and I'm sure we're going to come at some point to the kind of approaches, measures, and solutions, but when you look at the type of measures and approaches that security companies can put in place to reduce this risk, it's extremely close to the type of measures and approaches that we recommend governments and armed forces to put in place. You look at the vetting of troops, you look at the training and capacity building, you look at tools to operationalize protection in the way you design your operation. So you would design a military operation if you're in the military, but you would design your security activities if you're in the let's say, private sector. But all in all, and then of course you're looking at how to respond in case of incident. Let's say you're in the convoy and you were faced with a situation you have to use force. You have incidents you have civilians, which are involved in these incidents. How do you react? How do you engage with them? How do you engage with the community? Do you provide amends or not? How do you engage with actually national and international security forces that may be present? And all of this. So at the end of the day, the challenges and the type of risks that are there are very close to the one that armed forces may be confronted to. So, but this link that I'm making to respond to your question, how do these initiatives all fit together? This link I make it today in this panel, but it's still very thin actually in terms of initiatives and kind of structures. It doesn't really exist right now, and one of the reasons why, again, is the question of the data and the visibility on the incidents or potential risks entailed by civilians due to the presence and potential use of force of private security operators in these environments. So again, lack of data, but then in terms of the solution, very close to the solution that we can recommend armed actors need to put in place to reduce civilian harm.
Okay, and I've got one more setup question before we move on to the solutions and so on. For you, Jamie, which is, okay, you say there's a difference between military and security. We'll let that go. But when you look at cyber warfare and information, misinformation and destabilization and the abuse on various types of conflict these days, we were in a talk this week with Microsoft, who've just won a 10 billion contract with the Pentagon, but they want to have some status as a neutral. It's like, I don't, the world is changing, and who's security, who's military? Do you have people you turn away from your organization, or are you welcoming anybody and everybody who shows interest?
Yes, and before I get to your question, I'm going to piggyback on the three that you just asked as well. It's a thing, Sean, when you go last in the queues. I think you mentioned the local and international perspective. I think it's particularly important to emphasize that the discussion, the debate with regard to regulation, oversight, security contracting started at the international level. It was in response to international issues that we saw in the Middle East. But at its core, the issues today are at the local level. And I think Sean touched upon that when we spoke about the Tulloy example. I mean, we're looking at about 100 security guards for the local Turkana security company. And it's a very localized issue. So when you go to the guard posts, you'll see international code of conduct references in the guard post. And so you're taking very much an international instrument and trying to bring it down to the local level. The numbers in Juba, where I was last week, we had, it's about the biggest companies, two biggest companies have approximately between them maybe 4,000 or 5,000 security contracts. This is Juba, and there's about 10 or 12 companies or thereabouts, only two which have sort of kind of the international repute with international clients. One of those companies alone has a 1,500 personnel sort of contract with the United Nations. And they form part of an integrated security detail for the POCs, the Protection of Civilian Camps, in Juba and elsewhere. So you're looking at quite large numbers in that regard. Where does it sit? Where do these issues sit? That's partly the difficulty, but also, I think, part of the solution. It sits effectively everywhere and anywhere, both at the international level in terms of if you speak to governments, and that's one of the biggest struggles we have. You go to any government and you ask them who deals with the security contracting bit, and some guys at Foreign Affairs will say it's them, others it's a Department of Trade and Industry, sometimes the Ministry of Interior. No one desk has taken responsibility for this matter. They all take bits of it and move it on. And likewise, where does it sit in terms of the field of human rights, business human rights, humanitarian law? It's a mixed bag, because a lot of the actions of security companies are in conflict environments. But also what you're seeing is that many of these security companies, in especially these post-conflict environments, are reintegration mechanisms. So we're seeing security companies being set up to integrate former non-state armed groups. Or one of the big companies in South Sudan is veterans security services, taking on board veterans to give them a job, an employment, a career of some form. So it can sit virtually anywhere. And I think the question you had there in terms of, can you repeat your last question? I think the
question I had for you was like,
I like those first three questions. That was a bit easier. But,
what is not security?
Yeah.
Right? Where does it end? I mean,
do I turn anyone away?
The traditional image is a white male who looks a bit like me and maybe has a South African accent and is doing something shady somewhere hot. But is that really the people you need to be working with?
You have to work with everyone. I think most of them would have a beard and Oakley wraparound sunglasses as well. But you have to work with any one sort of individual. I mean, you have to look at both the services. The definition that you have in the International Code of Conduct is a very traditional definition. It's private security contracting, guarding, static, mobile, and potential armed or unarmed. But the range of operations and activities that security companies, most of the modern sort of larger security companies, is a whole spectrum. Everything from your classic static guard post counter security all the way through to risk management. And then as technology advances, we look at it in Iraq, when you're going out to, let's say, manage the seismic, when they put down the sonars, that's not a man duty in terms of the ones where they put in and the sonars go underground and so on. That's not leaving a guard next to that place. The pipeline security, that's not through individual guards going up and down the pipeline. And there you're seeing much more in terms of security and cyber potential that goes with it. I was speaking to a South African contractor the other day. They're trying to move away from individual guarding of facilities and CCTV to simply drones. So then we have all the big questions of autonomous weapons. Do you start arming drones? Do you start providing kind of equipment to deter individuals? What does that look like? So there's 1,001 issues out there. So I'll pause here because I know there'll be plenty more. Yeah.
Okay, quickly. Quickly, let's move on to solutions. Marlene, you have some examples, I think, of how some progress can be made.
Yeah, I think when we were talking about the challenges, we were talking about different things, and different things can be done, but this needs to be addressed as a really governance issue. And DCAF works in to respond to several of these issues with different actors. One of the things that we mentioned was the Montreux Document Forum, and DCAF is the secretariat of the Montreux Document Forum, and it also supports in the operationalization of the MDF. So for instance, one of the activities that we are supporting now is to do some national advisory support to support states into developing regulation on the private security sector. So how to adopt laws that respond to international standards. We were talking about the lack of data. And it's also something that we are starting to work on, or not starting, that we are working on, to support actors to conduct study and baseline study on the private security sector. We've supported such baselines in Latin America, in several states in Africa. We have regional or more national data, and I think this is a key point to understand the size of the sector, the challenges that they face to have an effective regulation of the sector afterwards. We have talked also about oversight and monitoring, and on this we worked. For instance, we set up, we've been supporting for some years now an observatory of private security of civil society organizations within Africa that provide with whom we watch to build their capacities to provide monitoring and oversight over the private security sector. So that's also something that we work on. And of course, we also talked about the supply chain that Jamie mentioned. And on this, I think our work within, to support the Voluntary Principle Initiative on Security and Human Rights is quite important, because it's an acknowledgement that the clients of the private security sector have a leverage over the private security companies, and they can set the standards that those companies need to be implementing. And on that, I'm also going to ask a question. Who knows about the voluntary principles on security and human rights in the room? Who has read the VPs? Who read the VPs in the last 6 months? Okay, so it's a set of principles, but it's quite short. And for us, it was necessary, and by talking to different companies, civil society organizations, it was necessary to unpack a little bit the principles and see concretely how do you implement them. And so we have a strategic partnership with the ICRC, and we worked with them to identify a couple of challenges that companies face in implementing the VPs and provide good practices in relation to that. And I said that we're working in the operationalization, and we're also working on some of in-country working groups to support the implementation of the VPs that are made of multi-stakeholder groups that identify some of the risk at the local level and try to respond to those risks.
So what happens in Civic, for example?
Yeah.
You all sit once a month and you...
They sit once a month. They have members of local communities that come to the meetings and that voice concern about private security. Is not so much of a huge concern in the Kivu. It's more public security that is really of a problem. But they voice concern about like presence of policemen who is asking money to minors so that they can enter the concession, for instance. So how do you deal with that? You need to, so first of all, they need to identify the problem. They need to have a police officer that is present in the room and that can actually have a leverage on those different actors. So it's really a dialogue that needs to be established, but with concrete action plan that needs to be then monitored into their implementation. So that's one thing. And then we worked also on training for public security forces. And especially police, so that they understand what are the different standards that they need to be following when they provide security around extractive sites. And we've done one in Kenya, in partnership with Tulo and with Sustainable that is sitting over there. And I think training is important. Oversight is also very important. So you need to ensure that once those officers are trained, there is also an oversight mechanism that is happening once there is a problem on the site.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. So I think we've done now we're going again to Jamie, because your responsibilities are making this better, and we're on that stage now of the conversation. So again, I'll repeat the question: Does ICOCA do any good? And how would we know? How would we know if your association is? How do you measure your progress in your 5-year strategy?
That's a set of questions, I dare say. Yes.
Okay, moving on.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I think we have to also unpack it. Yeah. The second part of your question was a bit of a strategic discussion in terms of how do you measure the impact, the effect of your strategic plan. And of course, as with any strategic plan, you then roll out indicators, metrics, and your KPIs and so on and so forth. And I love them. I think my board is fantastic. I think it's great that we have metrics, etc. But for me, the answer has to be much more: are we seeing a change of behavior at the grassroots level? That's where the difference has to sort of be seen. And are we seeing a change in terms of behavior, and I think also the engagement by security contractors and others to the dialogue. So again, just to take a recent example, yes, I can see a difference when I sit in with one particular security contract in the Turkana region. We're there with 4 or 5 of their guards, and they man and secure a potential hospital, and they have both female guards and male guards. And so we asked them the question, okay, how do you safeguard the environment for your female guards? What if you have a senior doctor in the hospital who's effectively been a bit too touchy-touchy and using his influence or power on the female guard, especially in a very tight-knit small community like Lodvar? What do you do? What processes do you have in place? And of course, they're taking notes down and say, well, the guard come and see us. I said, what if culturally there's a stigma attached to that? What if the female guard fears for her own job or potential safety or reprisal against her family if she comes out against a senior doctor who has potential political patronage in the environment? Have them think about that. And then no sooner had we asked that particular question, they take me to the administration and the head of HR of the hospital to actually ask that exact same question. Okay, so this is a question: how would we do that in some ways? That is already one, I think, example. Another example in terms of positive is to see coming out of a meeting in Erbil in sort of Iraq, where a security company was speaking about the positive impact the International Code of Conduct had on the behavior of its guards. Not vis-a-vis the guard and the civilian population, but the fact that the guard had taken some of the elements out of the Code of Conduct and gone home when there was a particular issue and resolved a potential conflict in his village by applying the Code of Conduct, and then came back to report that back to his or her management. That's a positive which goes beyond the Code of Conduct and beyond the security company itself, but goes to the community benefit that comes with it. Is it a complete yes? No. To the extent that at the international level, and this is where I think the dichotomy and I think the contrast is between the local and the international, at the international, there is still a lot of control by a handful of major security companies that won't necessarily allow or release fully control and oversight and allow for full transparency on the kind of security operations we're looking at. I look at some of the major extractive industry, excluding Sotolo and others. They would effectively, despite the voluntary principles, pull up a firewall and say everything's fine. We don't use private security. But then you ask that major extractive company, but you do use security? And they go, yes, and you are a private company. Yes, so your security must be private, so you do use private security. And they, oh, well, no, we didn't think of it that way. So the no is very much in terms of where the incentives come for the larger players. So at the international level, those with a big market, I think, space and where they can influence the market, but they don't necessarily listen to the Code of Conduct because they don't have the governments pushing in the right way. I know you put your hand up, so
you jump in. I'm not sure. You may have to give it back to him. No, go on.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. No, just to build up on what you were saying, I think indeed one of the challenges is, and solutions as well, is how you work at the local level. But indeed, we need more members in the ICOCA. I think you said rightly that we are in the kind of development phase of the ICOCA. It's the beginning of the strategic plan, but we are still already 10 years after the Montreux Forum conversations, and we have still a handful of governments, a number of private security is just extremely small compared to the sector itself. We still have huge dilemmas to resolve as well in terms of how we articulate the work and the challenges that are about small local companies and the bigger companies that you mentioned that are actually the ones that are very important in the market. And then in terms of government, indeed the number is not, and the diversity of governments involved is not sufficient today. Clients from the Western world, but also clients from conflict countries, which are actually the ones which are externalizing part of their also policing and security activities locally. So, and again, as I said, I think civil society as well is, we have a number of civil society organizations, but there is a question mark in terms of higher profile international organizations who have a capacity to push the line in terms of advocacy. And this question was high on their agenda after the Blackwaters story, so to say. But today it's not anymore. They're not, focusing on these questions. So we have to make it an issue. ICOCA is contributing to make it an issue, but for some reason, there is no visibility on this question. It's a growing trend, and it's not an issue. So I think I really want to salute the energy that's being put, by the team of the ICOCA and DCAF to push this agenda forward, but it's not sufficient. The numbers of people involved, clients, governments, CSOs is insufficient. The resources actually available to all of us, including ICOCA and CSOs, is insufficient to be able to have the bandwidth to actually produce and support this conversation moving forward. And yeah, I think it's an element to factor in.
Sean is, I'm champing. He's champing at the bit. But why, I want, along the same line, their participation is limited in the structure that Jamie's described. Is Tullow doing this because you're just like really nice people? Or is there a competitive advantage to doing this? Or what?
Both. Yeah, you mean it's not entirely altruistic. We're private sector, we're industry, and we're we feed the neoliberal economic system. That's what we do. That's part of our role. And actually, that's sort of not a bad segue into the idea. I mean, Beatrice, you're talking about the lack of PSCs in ICOCA, lack of government presence in ICOCA, and I think that's. Well, you need more. Okay, I mean, same one side of the same coin. But the way I see it, I mean, private sector can contribute that. We shape the market. Not only do we shape private sector market through our requirements, our standards, our contractual stipulations, how we do business, our behaviours, etc. And I can talk more deeply about standards. But equally, we also influence governments, especially if it's a large-scale development project. We're right on the cusp of now reaching what we call a final investment decision for a $3 billion project in Kenya. I know other companies in Mozambique that it's a $30 billion project. So you then need to speak to the government about elements where they are lacking. I talked earlier about governance, about some of the issues that we face in these more rural contexts where governance is the issue. It's not the private sector. It's the result of the private sector and the lack of governance. So we can help with requiring or placing, encouraging, let's say, requiring is probably a bit strong, but certainly promoting and encouraging alignment with things like the VPs, involvement with things like ICOCA, as part of almost our contractual agreement between us and the government for the delivery of the project. Because we're going to get to the point and say, okay, we need to do this. We will do X, Y, and Z. We will do the technical aspect of this project. We will get your oil and we will bring it out to the market. But to do that, we need you to help us with enhanced governance, with sort of better trained, better equipped, more accountable police officers, etc., to do that. And that becomes codified in the agreement. And then it draws in sort of, DCAF, where the work that you've done with us before, it draws in ICOCA. So there is a role for private sector in that, I think.
So let's go to
two things on that.
it's her turn.
Okay, her turn, but I'll come back, yeah.
Marlene. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was also. I think everyone has a word to say. I think that Tulo is also going towards this line because there is also a push from civil society organizations. There is a push from clients. There is a push from communities into stepping up their games. So everyone has really a role into advocating for better practices, so that companies then advocate to the government. There is also government that can advocate. So I think it really is multilateral and multi-stakeholder way of dealing with it.
Jim, you have a mic. Yeah. So we
Fully agree with what's been said. But I think we shouldn't forget there's a slight contradiction in what we're trying to say. We're talking about improved governance. But the very fact that we're operating in complex environments means there's going to be a weakened governance. So a lot of the push has to come from those that use the security companies to raise the standards. We speak about the extractive industry a lot, but I can guarantee in virtually every environment that we go into, where there's humanitarian actors, they use, as you're mentioning, they use private security companies. And the security element there is so bottom of the rung. You know, they have nothing in the budget, they don't think about it from procurement perspectives, and they hire a local consultant. That's what security looks like. And the two of the push comes from donors as well, that are basically funding these programs and funding NGOs. And as soon as we have a sort of reality check by many of these NGOs too, then we're not going to have that difference, because the NGOs will use local security companies and they'll feed the system. And so we need to come, a bit of a sandwich, come from the top with a good governance where it can be and where the donors are and where the governments can operate, but also at the grassroots level where the small entities using local security companies.
So what are the sticks and the carrots for behaving better? What is the benefit of behaving better, and what is the threat of not behaving better for a security company?
The stick should be an obvious one. If you don't have in place the right mechanisms, something will go wrong. And the stick...
What if something goes wrong, you reuse the local population and you still get the contract?
If something goes wrong, then you have the question of accountability that has to kick in. But accountability right now is very much based on the local solutions. I mean, our level of sanction is a membership-based organization. We can remove the member and the whitelist element, and they're off that list. That's the limit of, in many ways, what we can do. But somewhere along the way, I think the stick has to come from a level of accountability. If it's a local security company, that then has to rely on the local authorities. But if you're in a complex environment with limited governance, that may be a struggle. The, I think, most important stick for most security entities, and this is where it goes back to Beatrice's point about the blending of the different worlds, is a commercial one. Without the contract, they will not survive. It's as simple as that. And so it's very much upon the clients and those that use these security companies to expect the best of their security providers, to hold them accountable if something goes wrong. If there is a violation of human rights on their duty, then that company has to be held accountable. But right now, I think we're seeing people sort of brush it aside, and there's very little. There's big discussion about grievance mechanisms and access to remedy and effective remedy. But it's nice talk in Geneva, but what does that look like at the grassroots level as well? So a combination of accountability, commercial, as well as good governance where it can kick in.
I'm going to go to Bertice next, but from my own perspective, as an observer of the humanitarian sector and the international sector, one of the few things that does actually create change is public exposure and disgrace, but often by the media. And if you look at what's happening with the Me Too and the Aid To example, as well as contracting and other forms of corruption, is there not an argument, Bertice, that you have a blacklist as well as a whitelist, and that people who contract disreputable companies should be embarrassed?
Oh, that could be an option. I mean, it's a long discussion, whether blacklist and whitelist are...
And then we've got to have questions from the
I'm
huge
happy to
online community.
to hear questions. No, but where maybe to follow up on that question of public exposure and also the role of the media and the public opinion, including, for instance, public opinion in Western countries. It's interesting also because some are of the opinion that it's also more convenient for governments to use private security and military companies in conflict environments because the pressure of the public opinion and the media is less important. You have a collateral damage or incidental harm created by the French military or the US military in, let's say, Sahel, MENA, Afghanistan, pick your country. You have a huge scandal, a huge campaign, and mobilization of the media public opinion, etc. It's another story if you have an incident that's being created by a private company, and you don't have too much information, and you have to investigate actually who they are relating to, etc. It's much more complex. As I feel actually from this conversation, we are all still very much trying to be more aware of this question, but the level of knowledge of the question of private security is still very low, let's say. So. I think, we've talked of the responsibility of governments, clients, civil society. There is also a question mark for you, Ben, in terms of the responsibility of the media to actually try and create some more pressure from the public opinion in Western governments, but also local media, indeed, in conflict countries.
Well, I'll answer your question just in the spirit of not cheating. I mean, we had a conversation in our team in the newsroom saying, we have all the data from the UN's contracting over recent years, and we've been digging through it. And there was somebody we were discussing, is the fact that the UN spends so much money on the G4S family of companies, is that a story? Certainly in the United Kingdom, G4S has a shitty reputation, and the very fact that you work with them at all is almost a story, certainly in some segments of the media. And I think we decided not to because, G4S is so huge, you can't really sort of paint the whole company as somehow problematic. But it is something where the media has, I think, it's tempting as a journalist to say, ooh, bad guys, and private, the more hairy and the more South African, the better, frankly. When you look at the pirate, when I worked in Somalia, I often got questions from researchers about floating armories. This was a very sexy story where there was weapons kept on ships in international waters that the anti-piracy military and security companies, for journalists, yes, I think the journalists can play a positive role, but there is a temptation, I think, for even nice journalists to go for the dirtiest, most lurid interpretation, and certainly private security already has that risk that it becomes sensationalized. So I think I could invite you to, again, to finish any further remarks about how you make it better, and then we'll go to questions.
check and act, which is that assurance piece. Now that for us is the strongest piece. Oh, am I talking to myself? Sorry. So we have this plan, do, check, act approach whereby we can stipulate in our contracts you must adhere to the voluntary principles, you must achieve ICOCA certification, and then through the check and act process we can assure their alignment, we can assure their behaviours against these very high standards, and also they can self-assure as well. So there's a very close sort of level of scrutiny or a high level of scrutiny and lens that can be put onto these various different companies, and again we can put it into contracts. You must have this level of certification before you will work with us, and that will help. That's the sort of commercial aspect. That's where private sector can be very.
It's going to cost you more. The higher standards.
Well, actually, you know, and this is always the argument of a security manager is you know, what's the cost of not doing it? That's the thing. Ultimately, it comes down to that. If you don't do this, you're going to have a problem, and these problems can stem from a basic assault, which is bad enough in itself, but to an enormous community impact, which takes you offline for months and costs billions of dollars. So, you know, you've got to do the right thing. There's a moral aspect to this. You know, the world is changing. There is a lot of sort of observers, you know, sort of looking at how we do our business. But there's also a moral aspect that we should do our business right. And there is, you know, there's a financial aspect to that as well. I shall hand over. This one works.
I think, stick with the good, stick with the good man. A few more examples of how you make it better.
No, but I just wanted to also say that you ask about the cost, and then I think it's very important that in your procurement, and the same, like it goes with the extractive industry, but it goes with actors like the UN, that they don't go with the cheapest, but they really set standards that they need to, that companies need to respond to. So that I think this is important, and it's a cost-benefit aspect that needs to be taken into account. Yeah, on the good practices, on the way forward, I think, I think there is still a case to be made for all the different companies. I think, as we said, there is a need to go from international to local and ensure that it doesn't stay really at the international sphere, but it's really being applied to local actors, and that it rings the bell for local actors. So contextualization of the different good practices, making sure that they understand what they're supposed to be doing is important, and accountability is also a key that we really need to be working on.
Okay, thank you. So we've got 10, 15 minutes. Are there any questions from the online? I've got to read this. There's a charming child. We're wearing boots. Okay, so these are questions we've had from the online community. We keep the camera rolling. Why is there no visibility on private security issues? Well, first of all, you can challenge the question, I think. I mean, I think there is the Eric Prince visibility, but people, it's easily forgotten. I think that's the question. Why is there no visibility? Beatrice, I think we haven't heard from you for a bit. You are a chair. No, you're a board member.
No, I'm not a chair. Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I think I mentioned there was not enough visibility, but like the question of the why, I think again it's a question of the availability of the data, the question of the availability of the data coming from specific case studies that could be financially documented by NGOs, locally or internationally, but also a lack of data available online. You know, recently the British NGO and Jan Overton and his team, they did this review. It was for private military, yeah? Not private, but PMSCs, let's say in general. They went over 80 websites, and it's just a very interesting article to read. They find nearly no information on the website. Very difficult to track the profiles of the people, their history, the connection between the various groups, etc. So, but that's again, I don't want to mix too much private security and private military in that perspective. But still, I think again, lack of information coming from the civil society world, in spite of initiatives like the observatory, and again the lack of information proactively put online by the companies themselves.
Okay, let's open it up. Any comments, questions?
Thank you, excellent. Great, it's always good to hear